Okay.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. And I'm happy to try and take whatever questions people might have about those kinds of topics. This will be our last one of these for 2021. And happy to address whatever people will be interested in. I see we have a few questions left over from past times. There's one really simple one. It's a techie question from RBS. Can one use Wolfram Language to log on to a website with a username and password and read data? Yes, absolutely. There's a whole, if you use URL read, it's rare we have technical questions like this here, but if you use URL read with an authentication option with, what is it called? I think it's probably called username, password or something as a symbolic wrapper, it will specify how to do that. All right, different question. Okay. Well, there's a question here from Sleepy about, will computational chemistry and biochemistry programs be accurate enough in their predictions to completely dominate private R&D and reduce the cost of doing wet lab experimentation? This is kind of a mixture of science and business type question. I mean, the fact is, what one is usually most interested in is medical applications. And the thing to understand about medicine is it's more complicated than you can possibly imagine, so to speak. You have something which in theory, you have some hypothesis about how some particular process works in some particular kind of cell, and then you try running it. You know, first you run it just on cell lines, then you might run it on a mouse or something, then you try running it in humans, and all kinds of things will go wrong. I mean, if you look at the pipeline of drugs that kind of start at the sort of conceptual level versus ones that finally make it through approvals, it's an infinitesimal fraction that make it through final approvals, and it costs $1 billion to get there, so to speak. And and what's going on in those cases? Well, what's going on is that all sorts of different unexpected things fail. And people have gotten more sophisticated over time. For example, toxicology, how is the thing going to be poisonous somehow? That's something people got more sophisticated about. That's something where one can use kind of machine learning things to extrapolate from things one's known before, where one can use sort of various kinds of chemical prediction ideas to try and figure that out. But there's a lot of sort of unexpected things that happen in the giant legacy system that is our biology, so to speak. It also doesn't help that people are always different. And not only different people with different genetics, but people with different environments, people with different habits and so on. The effect that some drug might have on different people may be different, and that may be very hard to predict. And sometimes the absolutely best drug is one that is quite specific to some particular population. And that's really hard to even notice when you do traditional statistical clinical trials and so on. So the question I think being asked here is, to what extent can we do what in engineering has become very common, model-based design? I mean, in engineering, there was a time when every plane that one considered, every wing design, one had to build it and put it in a wind tunnel. Then computational fluid dynamics got good enough that quite a lot of things like that could be modeled. Same with other kinds of engineering, that there's this notion of model-based design. And the question is, can that be done for biological, medical type purposes? Can you do that same kind of model-based design? Can you kind of solve the chemistry well enough theoretically on a computer without actually deploying it in the field, so to speak? And as I said, I think one of the issues there is that the legacy system into which we are inserting things, it's not just a plane flying through the sky where it's just going through the air, so to speak. It's you're trying to supply that drug, that chemical, whatever, to actual humans, all 7 billion of them, with all their diverse different characteristics and the several billion years of evolution that go into us and make in many cases, sort of historical legacy features of all the different, the trillions of cells in our bodies and so on. So it's kind of complicated to know what's going to happen. Now, having said that, there was a big fad phase, I should say, maybe 20 to 30 years ago, for so-called rational drug design. The idea was, so a typical way that drugs are this is now segueing more into science than business, but let me say a few things anyway. A very typical thing, one of the more valuable assets of a pharma company will be its library of potential compounds, and then you can kind of test all of those compounds against some particular mechanism of action that you're interested in. And it's something where there's this kind of idea, sometimes combinatorial chemistry is one of the kind of terms used for this, where you're just trying out lots of different combinations and so on. You're trying a whole existing model of possible different chemicals that you collected from the bark of the tree of the such and such somewhere, or that you made in this way or that way. You're trying out all these possibilities to see whether there's some activity for some particular target that you've identified. And that's sort of a typical way to proceed. Now, can you do that at a theoretical level? Can you make a CAD program that sort of designs your molecule, and can you then figure out what's going to be active against what? And people have been trying to do this. It was sort of thought it was going to be sort of easy 20, 30 years ago. Turned out not to be so easy. Lots of effort has been put into it. And I don't know whether there are drugs on the market that have been, there aren't very many drugs on the market. It's what, 1,500 to 2,000 or so fundamentally different drugs that are on the market. I don't know whether any of the ones that are currently there were fundamentally designed by rational drug design, that is, from sort of first principles computation, as opposed to being found in a model in a library of chemicals or something like that. But so that tends to be this question of, could you start from scratch and just design a molecule that has the right characteristics? It's been difficult to do that. It's difficult. One of the issues that now does seem to be on its way to being solved is, if you have a protein, a biological type molecule, then how is it going to fold up? Well, that's something which there's now a better way to use machine learning to try and figure that out in advance. That's been a long-standing problem, and maybe that will help in being able to find, I need a molecule of this shape that fits into this particular binding site on this particular protein or whatever. Maybe that will help in being able to find that efficiently. No doubt it will. Then the question of what happens when you try and test it. There's a company, Emerald Cloud Lab, that uses our technology stack very deeply to create a kind of automated lab in the cloud. And that's a lab where conceptually, for somebody like me, you're just using software to do chemistry, but what's happening is actual chemistry is being done. Actual liquid handling robots are moving things around. Actual, test tubes are being heated up and shaken and stirred and whatever. And conceptually, for the user, it's as if you're just typing on a computer, but instead of a simulation happening at the other end, it's an actual physical experiment that's happening at the other end. The question of sort of what it's an interesting question, what the relative speed of kind of scanning possible molecules purely in a computer versus actually put them in a test tube and see what happens. It's obviously faster to do it in a computer, but by the time you have automated lab capabilities, it may not be so much faster to do it in a computer. But I think it will be interesting to see. One of the things, and this will take us too far afield for me to go into it in detail, but one of the directions that I'm personally very interested in right now is molecular scale computing. And I think there are some ideas that come from the formalism of our physics project that give one a different way to think about how to do molecular scale computing. And that one of the important features of molecular scale computing is that it is the thing that immediately interfaces to molecular biology and molecular scale medicine. What one can say, well, one's going to make some device, some medical device, but then it has to be sort of interfaced to us humans. But by the time you're dealing at the level of molecules, you are immediately sort of in the place where you are interfacing to the biology of us humans. So that's an important thing there. And that story of molecular computing is first and foremost a story of the concepts of what should happen. How should one think about the process of doing molecular computing? And then it's a question of the actualities of, can one design the molecules? That will be probably a mostly computational kind of thing, with having to check it by actually doing experiments. And then there are various aspects of deployment. But it's kind of the first step is kind of to understand sort of conceptually how one thinks about molecular scale computing. Okay, let's see. A question from Erin here. When did you first decide to hire people at Wolfram Research? How did you recruit and evaluate them? What have you learned about hiring since then? Okay, so I mean, I started getting people involved when we started building Mathematica in, what was it, August of 1986. I got people involved pretty much immediately because I did write a lot of code myself, but this wasn't a one-person project by any means. Now, in terms of how one evaluates people, first point to make is there isn't sort of an absolute scale of this is a good person, this is a bad person. The question is there a fit for what you actually want the person to do? And there are people, even over the history of our company, there are people where that person was a great fit in the early days of the company for such and such a role, but not such a good fit later on, or vice versa. Because as the company evolves, the nature of that role evolves, and the type of person relevant for that role may be different. There may very well be a different role at the company. For example, somebody who is very entrepreneurial and scrappy and able to sort of put things together with, with kind of duct tape and sealing wax and so on. That person can be a terrific operations person in the early days of a company when there's maybe a few tens of employees. That's exactly what you want for that. By the time you have hundreds of employees or more, you really want somebody in that kind of role who is much more systematic, much more kind of keeping on a track type thing. Because what's happening is going to be something much more procedural. And that original person, the person who's good at sort of duct tape and sealing wax, well, if there's an entrepreneurial piece to the company, if there's some special projects thing or some other kind of always doing something new area for the company, that's where that person should be. Now, in terms of hiring people, I have a pretty simple principle myself, which is that, when first of all, okay, so I tend to be more interested in the person than in the precise fit. Although sometimes I'll find people where I say, this is a terrific person. I really, really like many attributes of this person, but there just isn't a fit for that person right now in our organization. That person would not have a good time in our organization, even though I might suggest to them some other organization where it's like exactly the right thing for them. I think but in terms of kind of at the front lines of, is this the right person or not? My tendency, I tend to just do interviews with people. I have, try as I might, I haven't really been able to reduce the time for an interview much below about an hour. I mean, there are times when I certainly have an impression after 5 minutes, but I have to say, if I'm really to be accurate, I think it takes longer. And what happens? Well, it's just you're just chatting with somebody and you're trying to get to understand them, and it's much more. There are people and times in the distant past I used to have this in my arsenal of questions I ask. I kind of gave up on that, and I kind of really concentrate now on I just want to understand this person, and I like to see how they, in many kinds of positions, at least ones I'm interviewing for, it's important that the person be able to kind of think through things. And then it's like, well, we got this problem that we've had. What do you think about this problem? Hear them kind of try and think through it and see whether you kind of resonate with the way that they think through it. You'll find people where they will sort of think through it with you. That's kind of a good thing for the style that we tend to have. You'll find other people who want to take the point of view, no, I'm just going to sort of do something offline and expertly, so to speak, and just come back and say the answer is X. That doesn't fit as well in the culture of our particular company. It might fit well in other companies. But in general, I think that the thing that I found is if I don't think I know the person decently, by the time I finish the interview, it's usually a bad sign. And I usually, sometimes I violate my own principle, but I usually tend to try not to hire such people because I feel like there are always then uncertainties about what's going to happen. If you can get to know the person decently well in the discussion that you have, one thing I tend to notice is if I do most of the talking, that's usually a bad sign, and it's kind of because I'm kind of filling everything in, and it's kind of like it's if it's a good conversation, that's a good sign usually. Of course, there are exceptions to all these kinds of things. I mean, there are wonderful technical people, particularly, who are kind of very sort of cut and dried in their answers, and it's a terrible conversation as such. But they're terrific, and when you listen to what they actually say, you realize that it's really good. I think that the thing that helps in I like to talk to people about things they know about. So whatever area they've been involved in previously or whatever else, chat with them about that. That's a place where they will be less kind of, they'll tend to be more able to talk about it and perhaps more relaxed in talking about it. I mean, interviews where people are very nervous are terrible. I mean, you really don't learn much at all. And so that's definitely something to be avoided. And it's really, that's another reason why it's worthwhile to do a slightly longer interview, because people do tend to relax a bit if they were at first kind of, oh my gosh, what is this person going to be a total ogre or whatever else. But I think that's the kind of thing. Now there are, I like to actually see people think things through, at least for the kinds of positions that we tend to have. There are some positions for which it is possible to just outright test, can you do the thing that is needed in this position? That's relevant for things like data curation. It's relevant for, well, things like document quality assurance. It's relevant for some kinds of debugging of DevOps and things like this. I mean, that can be one where it's like there can be a person who is pretty terrible at expressing themselves, but when you say, there's a computer, it has these problems, what do you think is wrong? They'll be like, oh, it's blah, 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 blah. And they get it. Or you say, here it is, you do this, here's the situation, what would you do to try and debug it? And you listen to what they say and you say, well, then it will do this, and etc. And you see how the sort of problem solving process works. And even in cases where people are not great at expressing themselves, they can be great at kind of wrangling computers while not great at expressing themselves. I mean, I think, gosh, I mean, I would say I could yak on for ages about hiring people. I mean, the thing that is sort of a piece of lack of knowledge that I have at this point is that I'm not doing that much primary interviewing for our company. I only interview people who are either, oh, I don't know, going to work with me, or going to directly, or going to be senior people, or whatever else. Those tend to be the people that I interview. I would say that the sort of senior, particularly business people, can be very difficult to interview because they're just too experienced at kind of presenting themselves, and it takes a lot of effort to see what you actually have, as opposed to the thing that they think they should present for the interview. And I have to say, one case, a person who is a fantastic person at a company, the worst conversation I ever had with him was the interview I did with him. We had a theory of what to present, and the theory just wasn't really quite right. And it took a lot of drilling to get through the kind of theory. And when I got through the theory, it's like what I found was terrific. The theory just happened to be the wrong sort of coating, so to speak, that presented things really, really in quite the wrong way. So it's, but that can be and sometimes you find the other thing, the coating looks fine, but when you drill through it, what you find is something that is utterly unsuitable for the culture of our company, for example. I think, what else can I say about hiring? I mean, we end up with a very diverse collection of personalities, backgrounds, types of people, and so on. And I think it's important to kind of just think about, the only thing you're trying to figure out is, can this person do this kind of job in an effective way? All the details of sort of personality and all that kind of thing are usually not that relevant. I mean, there can be people who are, I don't know, and also sometimes people, something that can happen. People can be coming out of a situation, like they've been working in a place where it's just terrible, they hate it. And it really is a bad match for them. And you can see why it's a bad match for them. There are also people where they'll describe to you what was wrong with every one of the past 4 places they worked. And you realize that they're just going to, they're going to come to work with you and they're going to find something wrong with your place too. And that's, that's not great. But there are also times when it's like, here's a person, you can tell what they're like. They explain they've been working in such and such an organization. And you're like, oh my gosh, that couldn't possibly have worked. You would have hated it. And indeed they did. And sometimes people will be, we sort of coming out of that situation and will be a little bit funky because they're, they've been kind of squashed by that situation. And there'll be a certain recovery curve. And then they'll be terrific in an organization which is a better match for them. But it takes a little while for that sort of process to take place. I mean, I think in general, at this point, okay, and another thing I would say about hiring, there are positions where I've hired for that kind of position many times. And I think I have very high success rate of knowing whether a person who's coming in is going to be a good fit or not, and knowing what the signals are for things that are going to work out, not work out. But then there are always positions where I either, have very rarely hired for that position because we've had somebody in that position for years and years and years, and then they retire or whatever. And, we don't, or just it's a new kind of position and we don't really know what we're looking for. We don't really know what's going to work and what's going to be a fit. And those are the ones that are much harder and where the success rate is not so high. Probably, I think in the cases where one's experienced, it's like 90% or more. And in the cases where one isn't, I don't know, maybe it's 50% or something. So that's a little bit on that. I mean, I think that the important thing hiring people, you got to realize, for example, one issue is, do you quotes like the person? I don't know. I don't know even what that means. Is it like, would I find it fun to hang out with this person? That, that's an independent variable from whether the person's going to be able to do the job well. Is this a person who, it's a thing where sometimes there are people where you are like, oh yeah, this is a really fun, interesting person. For example, they can be very chatty. They can be talking about all kinds of things. And you realize they're never going to actually sit down and do kind of a systematic piece of work of the kind you need. Although they might be a lot of fun to chat with. Or you can find people where it's like, it's barely, only a few words come out, but yet you can tell for the thing they're going to be doing, they're going to be doing a terrific job. And when you have a very small company, that becomes more of an issue, I would say, of, how well do you get on with people? How well, when you're dealing with like founders of a company, there are important issues about sort of how people's kind of life objectives are aligned or not aligned. When you're dealing more with employees in a slightly larger organization, that's not quite so relevant, although it's worth figuring out, is this a person where this is just a great fit for them and they're going to be doing it for decades? Or is it a person where they are coming in and, they've done 5 other jobs before and each one has lasted a year? It's not necessarily the case that second person is a lose, because it depends what you want. But if you have a position where the ramp up time is 6 months and the expected time the person's going to be in the job is a year, that's not a good idea. But there are cases where it's like, look, for example, there might be cases where we're trying to do something we haven't done before. We really don't know how to do it and what's going to work. And having somebody come in and like they're going to do whatever they normally do. And if it works, great. And maybe they'll stick around. And if it doesn't work, it's like, well, they've got a 1-year timer anyway. So, on one goes and tries another experiment. So, there are lots of different niches. But I would say that as I say, one of the things, if you really don't understand the person and you can't answer the question, what would this person be like if working on this job? If you can't answer that by the end of the interview, my tendency is don't hire them, because you kind of don't know what you're getting. It's kind of like a random variable. You're throwing a dart. It might work out, but it's if you're, it's generally not a good idea. I think there are other attributes of hiring people. I don't know, one that I pass on. I mean, there's like, do you get references for people? Usually those are pretty useless, especially in the last however many years, as people have been worried about, oh my gosh, if I give a bad reference, somebody's going to come and attack me, and so on. And so people tend to give these very banal, oh yeah, the person's fine type references, and really, I've almost never found that useful. I did find back in very long ago, I found the one question that was somewhat useful that one can ask is, you describe the job that you want the person to do, and you ask the reference, if this person was going to fail at that job, what do you think the most likely way they would fail would be? And if the person says there's no possibility of failure, well, might be true, but you get no information. If the person thinks for a bit and says, well, maybe the person will get bored in a few months, or maybe the person will be not have a long enough concentration span, or maybe the person won't be able to understand what to do well enough or something, then you have information. It may not be, and you take it for what it's worth, and you ask the question, is that, you probe that area a little bit more carefully then. Anyway, a few thoughts there. Let's see. Well, there's a question here. There's all kinds of interesting questions here. All right, let's do this one from Benjamin. Have I ever read and replied to an unsolicited piece of email for somebody who has an important idea for our products, for example? The answer is yes. I mean, I get a lot of email from a lot of people, and it, I think, has, I keep on adding on other categories of email. Having a fundamental theory of physics, writing pieces about consciousness and things, those add on new segments of types of email. Being involved in the crypto space, all of these add on new types of emails, so to speak. So yes, I get all sorts of things. I try to glance at all of them, and sometimes I've had things that were just actually very interesting suggestions and ideas, and in fact, quite a number of people who've ended up working at our company have come from sort of unsolicited idea type emails. Now, one has to be a little bit careful when people send, you should do this specific thing, and it's my thing. And usually every time anybody mentions, there's all sorts of patents and this, that, and the other, as far as I'm concerned, that's fairly poisonous. I just pass it to the legal department, and usually we say, well, we'll only respond in some very, very formalized kind of way. But in cases where people are really making kind of an essay idea type suggestion that doesn't have those kinds of entanglements, the answer is yes. And in fact, I could tell you some interesting stories about people who sent us things, and we've ended up, sometimes they've come to work at the company, sometimes they've been involved in other ways, and lots of good things have happened from that. And I think it's my theory of life and the world and so on is that I have plenty of ideas myself, but I like kind of trying to absorb as much as possible about what's out there. And occasionally, see, one thing that can happen is, and sometimes perhaps it's frustrating to see, it's frustrating for me and frustrating for other people, like I'll have an idea and I'll feed it to somebody and it'll just bounce off. They won't do anything with it. And then I'll feed them the exact same idea 5 years later. It'll be like, oh, that's a great idea. And they'll go off and run and do something amazing with it. Same with me. there are people where people will tell me some idea, and I'll be like a good example. I think I can tell from a very long time ago, a chap came to work at our company from well, what was then still the Soviet Union, and had been involved in natural language processing kinds of things. He came and worked at our company, and said to me, "You really should, add on to Wolfram Language things for doing kind of linguistic processing." And I was like, "I don't get it. I don't see how we would do that. It's sort of not precise enough. I don't see how we would deal with kind of the sort of the vagueness of natural language." This was probably 1989 or something that this was happening. I just didn't get it. It wasn't, and he had somewhat defined proposals for what to do, but I was like, I just don't get it. Okay, that particular person went off, and I guess 2 steps after he left us was one of the founders of a rather successful search engine company. And then sort of many years later, I realized, well, actually, these suggestions, and he even remade the suggestions to me a couple of times subsequently. I realized eventually, oh, actually, that's something that now fits into what we're trying to do, and it's a suggestion that now makes sense. The thing that the suggestion was 25 years too early, and I just didn't have the right kind of, I didn't have the right framework, wasn't in the right place to really pay attention to it. So sometimes these things will, and sometimes it's like something that will be a fantastic idea, but it's 10 years too early, or a fantastic idea, but it's sort of too late for one reason or another, or it's a fantastic idea, but just not for us. It's something that we couldn't possibly run with. But yes, it's always interesting to get suggestions for people. I would say that sometimes, I would temper this a little bit by saying that ideas are sort of easy in a sense, and I have lots and lots and lots of them, and so do other people around our company. And it tends to be the idea together with the person to implement the idea tends to be much more the interesting case than just the pure, here's an idea, go run with this idea. It's very rare, actually, that a raw idea as such is something where that somebody will send me as something where like it's both relevant to us and we never thought of that before. That's a very rare case. But more common is here's this thing and here's a person enthusiastic about it, and that ends up being a story that can end very well. Let's see. It's a question here from Sander. Do you have developers that work in a large variety of topics, changing monthly, or are most in a kind of fixed position and topic? Interesting question. It really depends on the person. I have tried to have many times a kind of special projects group. And the problem with special projects groups, which is a place where it is like, here's a thing this month, here's another thing next month or next quarter or whatever. The thing is, in the experience of our company, is special projects groups have tended to be very successful. And that means that one of those projects that they do ends up hitting a jackpot of some kind. And it's like, then there's a great tendency for the people involved in that to just keep doing that thing. And then they don't stay as sort of special projects, change what you're doing from time to time. I would say that in general, for our core development, I would think the typical time for a project, it varies a bit with the person, but I think it's between about 3 months and a couple of years is the typical kind of time for the span of a project. Now, within that time, there'll be lots of individual pieces, there'll be some particular function that's being implemented, things like this. But that tends to be, for most of our mainline development efforts, I think that's probably about the time scale. As I say, I have tried to have kind of particularly people working with me, actually, these sort of special project efforts that have a slightly shorter cycle time. They are usually the victims of their own success. I would there've been some people actually who over periods of a decade or more have definitely been in the special project cycle quite a bit, and where it's very much more kind of going through and going from one project to another over the course of time. I mean, there are also, I would say, there are other parts of the company, not core internal development, where it works very differently. For example, in our solutions team, working with outside companies to do large-scale solutions to their business problems with our technology, that tends to be, I don't know, that's usually, I think those are usually few-month type blocks of project. And then our technical services group that does somewhat smaller scale projects for companies, I think that tends to be more on timescales of order weeks for those projects. So that there are different kinds of things. These things that are more outward facing tend to have somewhat shorter cycle time. Actually right now we're just trying to build up a new special projects group. As I say, our special projects group have both, it depends on how you look at it, have either a terrible history or a wonderful history. Terrible in the sense that they keep on being dragged away into mainstream development, and wonderful in the sense that that's what they end up creating, so to speak. Let's see. There's a question from Slayer. At the stage we're at with Wolfram Research, how do we try to ensure that we continue to innovate, don't lose ground to competitors, make the wrong business decisions? Well, you know, we're now a 35-year-old company. I'm very proud of the fact that we continue to do new stuff all the time. That is really something that ends up getting burnt into the culture of a company. You either have it, you develop it, or you don't. I think with our company, at the beginning, we were just doing Mathematica, what's now Wolfram Language, and went very well. And I personally went off and did in the 1990s, spent a bunch of my time doing my big basic science project, New Kind of Science, that's launched a bunch of other things. But I would say that there was a period of time in the 90s where we were kind of settling into the systems that we needed to run our company efficiently, but we're not innovating at a particularly impressive rate. We were really just doing kind of more of the, you know, just polishing, not really innovating. Then when I kind of finished my big science project in 2002, I kind of came back because I'm kind of interested in innovation. That's sort of that's why I do what I do, is because I like to do new things. And I really tried to, you know, put our foot on the gas, so to speak, of innovation. And at the beginning, there were issues with that, because people have been working 10 more years or more on sort of mainstream things. And they're like, why are you doing this different stuff? You know, we have a business and it's working well. And they probably were right. If our goal was to make the most successful business as a business, that's probably would be the right thing to do. Just stick to the things that work. My personal interest has always been to do new things. And that's kind of driven a culture in which we expect to do new things. And once people have the expectation, we're going to do new things, we're going to invent things, that eventually gets baked into what people expect at the company and the way that new projects get done. And people don't immediately say nowadays with our company, because they've seen enough examples of where things that were started as crazy special projects ended up being important mainstream things. I mean, a random example in the last few years has been like blockchain stuff, which was started as a pure kind of off on the side special project. It's now become a significant business direction, but that's something which could have been killed at the beginning, because people would say, you know, people who would just see our mainstream part of our business would say, how does that relate to the mainstream part of our business? It's kind of a bit of a tall tale at the beginning, but we're just used to doing new things. It's turned out the physics project of ours, which is another kind of new thing that I just sort of did because I wanted to do it, has now fed us back just a huge number of ideas and directions for technology, which hopefully we'll see come to fruition over the next year or two. But I think, you know, in terms of how to make this possible, it's number one is culture of the company. Number two is, you know, we're a private company. We have, I think, a fairly strong core business. and we don't, we have to some extent the freedom to try new things, and we expect to try new things, and we don't, it's something where we don't have people saying, oh, we need a X times return on investment by this time in order to satisfy our upstream venture partners or whatever else, or upstream limited partners for our fund or whatever. You know, we don't have that. So we don't have those kinds of drivers of short-term results. And that means that we've been able to do plenty of projects that have, you know, decade type timescales. I have to say, they mostly, when we started them, the people doing them, and even myself, were like, this is going to take a couple of years. And well, actually, it took a decade. And the fact is, we can do that. We didn't kill the project because it was taking longer. It just, we realized it was harder than we expected. But it's something that we can do. We like to sort of maintain a portfolio of projects, which from ones that deliver results quite quickly to ones that have very long timescales. I think, how do we not make the wrong business decisions? Well, that's always a question. It helps to have a bunch of experience. I think one of the things that happens, you know, every day, you know, I end up, and many people at our company, but I know for myself particularly, you know, I make lots of decisions, making decisions all the time. And, you know, you get more experienced at doing it, and you get faster at doing it, and you get faster at knowing the kinds of mistakes that you make. So, you know, for example, typical example, decision I have to make real soon has to do with, you know, should we invest a certain amount in a certain thing? And it's like, I know that I've made certain kinds of mistakes on this before, and I know that it's, the needle goes in a certain direction, and I know that there are certain kinds of things that, you know, one of the issues is, if you did something a certain way and it didn't work out in the past, does that kill you ever doing such a thing again? Or do you, you know, you can make the mistake where you say, I really want to do this. It failed once, it failed twice, it failed 3 times, but I'm going to keep doing it because I'm so keen to do it. And you always have rationalizations of why it failed the first 3 times. But actually, you know, there's the question of if it failed, you know, how much do you pay attention to the failures? And that's something where I think experience again helps, and trying to understand what are the important variables, what are not the important, what are the variables that aren't important, what is something where it's going to fail. We just can't do something like that. Just doesn't fit within our organization. It's a kind of arrangement, kind of thing that just isn't going to work, versus, oh, that failed that particular time because the wrong person was doing it, or because it just didn't make sense in the way the market developed right then. I mean, there are things where, for example, we've done sort of spin-off projects and so on, and products where when we started them, it seemed like a very good fit for the market, but it took much longer than we expected. And by the time it was finished, it's like nobody cared. That's something where you could say, well, we shouldn't redo those kinds of things because we might have that same problem. But, you know, if we make sure that we don't have this issue of timescales again, then we won't have that problem, or we have less chance to have that problem. So I think, I mean, it really helps to have just made a lot of decisions, and it helps also to not agonize too much about them. I think that, you know, there's a certain cost to taking a lot of time to make a decision. It's often better to just make the decision and move on, even if you're going to be wrong 10 or 20% of the time, much better than to spend, you know, a month kind of noodling about, should you do this or should you do that? In a sense, you've lost before you begin if you spent that whole month noodling about it. Then you know you lose, as opposed to, well, you took a definite decision and maybe you're wrong 10% of the time. I think also, I tend to be a person, people would say that you know, I always like to know what goes wrong with things, both sort of business decisions and technical things. You know, why did our servers go down? Why did this happen? Why did things blow up in this way or that way? Why did this project not get finished? And I've collected over the course of now, you know, 4 decades or more, I've collected a very big inventory of how things go wrong. And so you might think that would drown one, that one would just be always thinking, what's going to go wrong? What's going to go wrong? But actually, I think it helps because I do think what's going to go wrong. I'll read some document or something, or I'll hear about some plan, and it's like I'm immediately going through my mind, what's going to go wrong? And like, does this match a pattern from some previous thing that I've worked on where something went wrong? But that's very helpful to know that, because it's like, then you're not just worrying, oh, might something go wrong? There's 10 things that might go wrong. I've seen these before. Let's check them off and see whether we are protected against this or that thing going wrong in this particular case. So I think, it's a case where experience helps. I think that it is, it depends a little bit on people's psychology, but I tend to be a person who's like, what's the worst case scenario about what could happen? Okay, how do we remediate that worst case? And then you kind of work up from there, rather than like, it's going to be great. And, and never look down, so to speak, and never try and figure out what could go wrong. I feel much more comfortable if I kind of know what could go wrong and sort of understand how to remediate it, than if it's just like, we're going to get across the bridge and don't look down type thing. That tends to be my way of doing that. But different people are different. And the thing that is a guaranteed lose is if you're always looking down, you're always worrying about it, and always kind of noodling about what could go wrong, and don't ever walk across the bridge at all, so to speak. Now, another issue is, to what extent are you like looking at what everybody else is doing and saying, let's do something a little better than what those other guys, the competitors who are rushing up to us and so on are doing. That is not, it's just not something I'm terribly interested in. I tend to be much more interested in building things that I think are new and important and unique and so on. And it's like, if somebody else is going to do this, let's just let them do it. And we'll do something different. We've got plenty of things to do. If that's a market or a place where there's some other company or whatever that's well positioned to do that, let them do it. And let's do the things that we can uniquely do. Now, I think that we've gotten ourselves in a position where we really don't have direct competitors. We have, we built this big tower that's really quite unique, and that's great. It means that, we're not worried about lots of things looking over our shoulder all the time and so on. It also means that we have a big challenge in explaining to people what we have, because people say, well, you've got this unique thing. What do you have? It's not like this. It's not like that. It's not like the other thing. We don't understand what it is. So it's kind of a, sometimes be careful what you wish for, because we have built something that's very unique and very not something where there are competitors anywhere near, but it's something where we have to explain to people what this thing that we have actually is. And that's the challenge for us, rather than, can we stay a step ahead of the competitors, so to speak. I think it's a different, it depends again. There are people that I know who run companies where they're, what they do every day is they wake up every morning and they look at what their competitors are doing. And then they say, how do we sort of, get ahead of that? That's completely not my way of doing business, but there's room for all sorts of different styles there. Question from Slayer. As someone with a technical background as I have, how do you maintain a holistic overview of your company? For example, do you better attempt to understand the company's financial books and so on? For me, anything that I don't have to think about at the company, where I am confident that it's going to run smoothly, is a win for me. I mean, I like to be able to drill down and understand everything, but if I don't have to do it, that's the best possible situation. Where it's something where, for example, the sort of detailed financial kind of aspects of the company. Fortunately, because we've had a strong business for a long time. It's not something I'm usually deeply wading through, but it's good. In fact, I just did it yesterday, looking through a bunch of financial data and like, why did this cost X amount? What's in this line item, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, I would say that the meta thing is that, when I see some, I don't know, something about currency exchange, profit loss on a P&L or whatever else it is. It's like, I expect to understand every line. I don't expect that somebody's just going to tell me, oh, that's some accounting thing, you're not going to understand it. I mean, I expect that I'm at least capable of understanding every line. And to me, that's an important meta aspect of running a company is, can you in principle understand everything that's going on? Now, hopefully you don't have to look at this because it's all running smoothly and it's not something you have to worry about. But if push comes to shove, do you understand how this sort of accounting calculation actually works? I think it's important to be able to do that. And I think, I try to collect the information about sort of how all these things work, even if I don't actually have to pay attention. And I hope I don't actually have to pay attention to these kinds of things. But yes, I think the ability to understand is very important. I mean, there are plenty of people I know who run companies, and particularly people who are not terribly technical, who have companies that do some kinds of quite technical things. And that's a very challenging thing to manage such a thing, because you're dealing with technical people who say, oh, we just can't do this because there's I don't know, the blah, 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 some jargon technical thing. We just can't do this because whatever. And the somewhat non-technical person might say, explain that to me. And they may just get another load of jargon and explain that, another load of jargon. And, in the end, how does such a person manage that process? Often what it comes down to is, look the IT manager or whatever in the eye, and do you trust what they're saying? That's what you have to be. It's a very human kind of thing, because it can't be content because you just don't know the content. I think one of the things that happens if you're a sort of techie person and you take the point of view, as I do, that one can sort of understand everything, is you don't get in that situation. It's not so much of a trust me type story. It's a explain it to me and let me see all the details. And then at the end of it, I may say, I mean, sometimes it'll be, somebody may say, get all the details, and I'll say, look, it's your art to figure out how to do this. I don't know, but at least I know the details. I know what's going into those decisions. And the person will say, I think we should do this or that. And it's like, okay, I can see why you would say that. It's not something where I can say you should tip it this way rather than that way, because they have more experience in this than I do. But on the other hand, I kind of know what's going into it, and I can tell that that's not a crazy conclusion, as opposed to a situation where they're just saying, trust me, I know what to do, and I just don't believe they've thought it through. I mean, if they've exposed the things that go into the decision, and I can kind of see there's this one step where I don't know whether we should go this way or that way, and they say, I think we should go this way, and that can make sense to me, then that's all good, so to speak. Let's see. Then True is asking, what is my workout routine? I'm an old guy. For a long time, I didn't really pay attention to, I was like eating whatever I felt like eating, and I was just never took any real exercise. Finally, when I got to about 40 years old, I realized, my wife had been telling me this for years, but she's often told me many things that I didn't listen to for a long time, even though they turned out to be right. I started realizing that actually I felt better and worked better and so on if I took some exercise. So what I tend to do is I will walk, more than 10,000 steps every single day. And I've done that. For example, during this pandemic, there hasn't been a single day when I've walked less than 10,000 steps for the last 2 years, basically. In the past, random trips and things would cause me not to do that. Although now I've pretty much resolved I'm always going to do that, even if I'm walking around an airport, or even if I'm, even if it's a weird time of day or I don't know what. What I tend to do is the first meetings I do during a day, and my days, particularly on weekdays, always have meetings, at least in the earlier parts of the day. The first couple of meetings, which is, you know, hour and a half, 2 hours, I will do while in motion, so to speak. If I can, I'll walk outside. If it's too cold or raining or something, I'll walk inside on a treadmill, and I just walk at about, well, it's now about 2 miles an hour, 5% incline. So really kind of, by many people's standards, kind of a lame amount of exercise, but it's you know, you do that systematically every single day. That I think that certainly has helped me a lot. And then I usually a couple of times a week, I've well, it's been over Zoom for a while now, but I get somebody to try and get me to, like, you know, sort of move around and do some version of, I don't know what it is exactly, some Pilates-like thing of like, okay, you know, I think with my particular physique, you know, my main thing is utter inflexibility, so to speak. I like to think that even if I'm mentally flexible, I may not be physically so flexible. And so that kind of helps that. But you know, that's kind of a total of like a bit less than an hour a week. And those are my main things. And I like to make sure that I sleep enough and so on. And that's what I do. And I found when I'm walking on a treadmill, I have a whole setup with a computer and so on. And I have to say, because I'm not doing terribly strenuous exercise, I can always, you know, like, you know, be on phone calls and things like that, or whatever. Sometimes when I'm walking on a treadmill, I think if I switch on the camera, it's just going to make everybody seasick. I don't usually use the camera for that, except a few times with people I know well who are kind of very big enthusiasts of, you know, have become big enthusiasts of kind of the video call type thing. I will switch it on, even though I think it will make them seasick to watch me kind of walk up and walk along. And I've tried to do various kinds of things with image stabilization. So far, no luck with that. Yeah, by the way, I did write a couple of years ago, I wrote a long blog post about sort of how I try and lead a productive life, and lots of kind of life hacks about that. When I walk outside, I tend to, these days, I'm not typing type meetings. I do have this whole sort of setup with this kind of like popcorn selling type thing where I can put a computer, you know, hang a computer in front of me and be able to type on it while I'm walking around. But I have to say, in recent times, I've tended to do meetings where I'm either just talking or I'm just watching things either on a tablet or just a phone, just watching somebody else sharing a screen, for example. Question from the universe. How do you balance time being creative for projects versus everyday necessary work? That's a challenging thing, and it requires a certain strength of mind, I would say, to do that. I mean, it will be easy for me to just spend all my time doing sort of just the next step in the next step of things that I'm sort of always in the flow of doing, so to speak. I get excited about projects, and so I carve out the time to do them. And it's always remarkable to me, you know, I write these long things, and I write an absurd amount. I think this year, I think I've written about 400, you know, text pages of single-spaced, you know, pages of like book pages of big book pages, I think, of material on you know, blogs and other things. And I think it's always surprising to me that it feels like that time can just be carved out from nowhere. When I get enthusiastic doing one of those kinds of things, I'm like spending all my time in the evenings and things like that, working on that. And when I'm not working on it, other things just sort of seep in and use that time. I'm processing email, I'm doing meetings, I'm doing this, but somehow when there is creative work to be done, when I get enthusiastic about it, which I do rather easily, that sort of, it sort of somehow that manages to to find its way, there are cracks that finds its way into, and those cracks expand to the point where I can get it done. But I do like to take the point of view that I'm going to spend a significant amount of time doing creative work, and there are always fill-in things when I would say that at times in the past, particularly when I've done larger projects that last a year or two, I can work very intensely on them, and then the thing is finished, and then I will have what I used to have. I don't really have these so much anymore, what I used to refer to as an inter-project gap, where it's like I've finished that big project. There's a bunch of routine stuff to do, but I always had a kind of this weird state that I was in during these inter-project gaps. I don't really have that anymore because I have enough of a portfolio of different projects going on that I'm never in the state where sort of everything is gapped, so to speak. And I've always got some other thing that's like the little bit, another creative project that's not quite as high priority that kind of can now get done, and so on. And it helps me that often these projects I'm doing have a very well-defined structure, in the sense that I'm eventually going to write something about something, or eventually going to do something for some product. Those tend to involve many more people. And it really helps me that they're well-defined, beginning, middle, end type things, rather than sort of long trailing things that don't really have a well-defined kind of it's finished now type character to it. But I like to make sure that one of the challenges is, how do I ever get to do new stuff? And there are many people who really don't manage to get to do new stuff. They get to the point where they've been doing a bunch of stuff and it kind of starts owning them after a while, and they never get to do new stuff. And I think it helps, as I say, when one has, I have a bunch of enthusiasm for new stuff, and that means that I somehow managed to carve out the time to do it and start doing it. And there's the question of, okay, so another thing that kind of helps to have more experience at it is like, how much can you throttle back on something and have it not fail horribly? How much can you not pay attention to that aspect of the business, for example, and have it not fail horribly? So I have some guesses about that usually. Sometimes I will err on the side of throttling back more, because I then can have more time to do sort of creative projects that I want to do. And sometimes the result of that is I have to go in and recover that thing a few years later. I tend to think that is a better solution than always looping and spending time worrying about, am I maintaining this particular thing continually. I think it's usually, at least for me, a better calculation to like say, look, that thing seems to be running okay. Let me just not worry about that right now. And I'm going to spend that time doing other things. And if it turns out later that, oh, that thing has gone a bit off track, then you come in and deal with it. I mean, there are things where I built some piece of procedures or technology for us 25 years ago, and it kind of, I was like, okay, we're more or less done with that particular thing. Let's just leave it and let it run. And then 25 years later, it's like, this is pretty long in the tooth now. We got to do something about it. And you parachute in and you start doing something with it. But it's a pretty good calculation that you saved that 25 years of not having to worry about it, even though it might have slowly, 1% a year or something degraded in sort of relative quality. That was still sort of okay, because the aggregate time that you spent, it was much better to come and sort of parachute in as it got down to the level where it's kind of getting into the yellow zone or the red zone type thing, that you come and fix it, rather than worrying every week, do I have to do something with this now type thing. Let's see, maybe one or two more and then we should wrap up. Let's see. The question here from Busy about crypto projects, and saying there's always a battle between centralization and decentralization in crypto projects. You need a certain amount of centralization to get things going. How long should a project be given before you let in the masses, so to speak? I have to say, when I hear people say, I'm going to build this little platformy thing, and then the world's going to solve everything for me. The masses are going to come in and they're going to do everything. I'm like, yeah, I just don't believe you. It's a pretty rare thing when you've done the exact right positioning and building of technology and sort of social engineering and understanding to get it to the point where the masses are going to come and do your work for you. It can happen, but it's not something that you can assume will happen. What I've found is that the cases where we've had the best contributors have been the best defined things. So for example, our Wolfram demonstrations project, which we started, I don't know, 14 years ago or something now, or our function repository. These are places where the definition of what one should contribute is very well defined. You're making a demonstration, you're putting in a function. I know from contributing these things myself, it's really easy. It's very well defined, it's very well scaffolded. It's not like, oh, should I do something roughly like this or roughly like that? It's like, do this kind of thing. I've got a particular piece of content that I'm trying to contribute. And now I've got all the scaffolding and I'm motivated to contribute that content, perhaps because I want to use it myself. And it's like, okay, great. I'll set this up, I'll put it in, it's all good. Whereas if it's much more of an open field of like, oh, you should do something, it's much more difficult, I think, even for myself to contribute to such a thing than something that's well scaffolded. So I think, when you have a project, unless it's really well defined what you want people to do, if it's like, well, I've developed a little bit of the software, hey world, come and finish it for me. And I'm not going to tell you what to do, just make it up. I think that's very hard to make work. If it's like, it's set up in this or that way, what you have to do is set up a server that's going to be part of some blockchain or whatever else. It's very well defined what you do. And if there's if that's something that has a motivation for the people doing it, then that's something that can happen. But it's much easier for somebody to say, I'm going to download the software, set up the server, than it is to say, I'm going to invent some new module that's going to do some amazing thing here. So I think that would be my criterion. Once it's very well defined how people can contribute and what they can contribute, and when the minimum time to contribution is quite short, and when people can do it without having to innovate, then I think it's without having to structurally innovate, let's say. I mean, something like our demonstrations project or function repository, the content is innovative, but that's something that somebody is innovating on anyway. But they don't have to innovate in terms of the structure, so to speak. So I think, again, when people's business model is, we'll do a little thing and then the world will do everything else for us, I'm like, yeah, I just don't believe it. Again, there are a few counterexamples. They usually started with very definite groups where there was a definite kind of motivation, a definite kind of connection between the people doing it often, and a definite kind of, we know why we're doing this, we're on the same mission together, and we're going to put these pieces together. I think I mean, in my own experience in sort of things like volunteer curator kinds of things is, some people do wonderful stuff. There's a small number of people who do wonderful stuff. There's a bunch of people where it takes you more effort to integrate what they've done than it would take to do those things internally. Because in the end, it tends to be better just to have people that you can train yourself, and their productivity is so much higher than people who aren't really trained and are doing things where they're kind of off in a slightly different direction. Again, it relates to how sort of well scaffolded the whole thing is. If it's really well scaffolded and people just have to add this particular piece that is a piece that they're really interested in adding, then it can work much better. I think that the promise of some crypto projects is it's all going to be decentralized, but it's decentralized after you've built a whole infrastructure that just allows you to have, a node that somebody can download and deploy without understanding anything, without knowing, oh, this thing is using this cryptographic protocol and this kind of, decentralized pool of this and that and the other, and incentive structure and so on. The less they have to understand, the more likely it is that you'll be able to get it to work in that way. And I think the idea that the crowd will figure out ideas for you, I think that tends to be quite doomed. And it tends to be something where when people think, not least because, yes, the crowd, in a sense, can come up with ideas, but they'll be in all kinds of different directions. And raw ideas just floating around like kind of random molecules in a gas or something, it doesn't really, it's more like heat than like mechanical work. It's, yes, there's a lot of energy there, but it's not directed in an organized way that can move things forward. So, and that tends to be something, to direct things in an organized way to move things forward tends to require leadership. And that tends to be something where it's not really just have the crowd randomly contribute things. It tends to be somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to be defining a direction. People may or may not like the direction. They may or may not choose to be involved, but somebody has to be defining that direction. And that's how things end up getting moved forward. Okay, I should wrap here in just a moment. I think there's some questions here about Charlie Munger and his ideas. I don't know enough about them to really comment. There's a question here about, do I use kind of rules similar to Cellular Automata when managing our company and our company's projects? I've often wondered, I've studied a lot what simple computational rules can do and the richness of kind of things that can result from simple computational rules. And I've certainly wondered, am I applying those ideas either implicitly or explicitly to the kinds of things I do in kind of business and management and so on? And I've often thought, no, I'm not really doing anything related to that at all. But it's not true, because in a sense, what that's all about is you kind of meta model. You have this kind of system and you say, what is the underlying fundamental essence of what's going on in the system? What are the sort of essential kinds of rules that you might study to find a system like this? And it turns out that activity, what's very similar to language design, in sort of designing a computational language, the story is, you've got all these computations people might want to do. Can you kind of drill down to find the essential primitives from which that can be built up? And in dealing with the company, it's kind of the same thing. What's the essential point of what we're trying to do? What is that thing that is the kind of the one idea that, we've got all these different things going on, all these opportunities that are like this and like that and like the other thing. Can we find a sort of essential primitive where we say, well, let's make all of those things work this way? I'll give you an example. It's when I was first doing my new kind of science project, get all kinds of letters from people saying, oh, I'm interested in this. I'd like to work on it. Can I work with you? Can I do this? Can I do that? And it's like, well, what is the one essential thing we can do that will kind of integrate all these things people want to do? And we realized, oh, we can do the summer school. And that's kind of the one primitive, in a sense, that we can use to solve this problem of all these people with all these different objectives and slightly different orientations and so on that want to somehow be involved. Oh, we've got this one structure that we can put all these things into. The same kind of thing across a lot of things at our company of, can we build sort of a systematic structure into which we put a large collection of otherwise apparently inchoate kinds of things? And the thing to understand about running companies is that special cases are very expensive. If you've got something where it's kind of, there's a procedure for doing that, and you're sort of turning the crank, and that's how things, that's how you deal with things like that. That can be done. It can be done by comparatively junior people in the organization. It can be done in parallel by many people. You can have an operations manual that says what to do. New people can come in and do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's in a sense, it's a much cheaper thing to do. Anytime everything is a special case and things have to bounce up to senior management or whatever, and have to get, somebody has to think explicitly and innovatively about each individual case, that's a very expensive thing to be doing. So it's important to try and design, what are the primitives that are sort of the things that you try to identify that can be functions of the company. So for example, give you an example in recent times, all these different cases where we're thinking about how our software can be run by different people. Oh, it's running in a cloud server. Oh, it's being deployed on a cloud service. Oh, it's being put in a code repository. Oh, it's running in an embedded system. Oh, it's being licensed at some organization that has this or that thing. I realized that there are all these different incoherent pieces that all sort of seem very different. But then I realized that they all fit together. They're all sort of a deployment story. And so, we're in the process of making a group that's about deployment engineering. It's about kind of all these different cases, and that then becomes a definite thing. So when something else comes in that's a bit like that, you say, oh, let's put that in the deployment engineering group. And they've done a bunch of similar projects, and they have the means of doing it. I mean, in the past, we've done things like this. We have an example is import-export. It was like, oh, you can import, this kind of file and that kind of file. You can export this kind of file, that kind of file. Eventually, and that becomes sort of a product feature. It's like there's just these functions, import, export, and there's a definite group that deals with those. And sort of everything of that general type goes in that bucket. And people get to be experts at dealing with that category of thing, even though each individual thing is very different in character. Another example, actually, also in the deployment area, we have a group called Deployed Products and Services. It's kind of a weird name, but what it's dealing with is things like our repositories, things where we are sort of building on top of our technology stack to make something which is which is sort of a receptacle for yet more content. That's hard to explain, isn't it? But that's the point. It's sort of identifying that, and we take, when we create new groups at the company, we spend a bunch of time thinking about what are we going to call this group, because it matters, because that's sort of what defines that's what crispens up the concept of what that group is doing, and what's the bucket of things what's the collection of things that you can put into that group. What's the collection of things that sort of fit together and can be done coherently by that group of people, and where there don't have to be special cases. Even, you end up with groups that are almost the group that's dealing with the special cases, in a sense, becomes when the special cases are like, I don't know, people who are enthusiastic users of our products and have all kinds of different needs and so on, and all kinds of different forms of interaction. That's something that becomes a group that is dealing with that. Sort of, you're factoring the set of things that have to be done on that axis, so to speak, and that's how that works. So I would say that this concept of kind of drilling down to figure out what the primitives are, and sort of finding what are the essential simple rules, that's absolutely something that we're using. The concept of just start the thing running and see what it does, well, that's something for nature to do. It's something for, but it's something where that's not, sometimes one realizes there are things where that's all that's going to happen. We can start the thing off, we can launch it, and we don't know what's going to happen. And there's no point in agonizing about, oh, are people going to like this or that, or how are they going to respond to this or that? We just don't know. And there just aren't ways to predict that. We can have a theory, but the chance that theory is right is not all that high. And so the thing to do is to do the experiment with, if possible, as low a cost as we can, where we're just getting something out into the market, so to speak, or something out into the world, and being able to and that way seeing what's going on. And that's kind of, my kind of computational irreducibility idea. We end up having end up in a sense implicitly using that in terms of, well, this is a thing where we're just not going to be able to figure this out, so we might as well just put it out there and see what happens, rather than trying to do a market study of this and a focus group of that. And it's like, I know this is going to be mush, because by the way, that's one thing to say. I mean, there are things where unless it is out there in the exact form that it's going to be presented to the world, you just don't know what's going to happen. Like Wolfram Alpha was a great example of this. The sort of early, oh, let me show a particular person this particular thing in a focus group and so on. It's like I learned quickly that we were going to learn nothing from that. the only way we were going to see what happened is to get it out in the world with a certain amount of presentation that allowed people to understand what to expect, and then see what people do, and then see how people react. But it needed that whole packaging of how it got out there in the world, how significant the world took it, how it was presented in the world, how the actual servers were running, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It needed all those things to get a realistic view of how people were going to respond to it. And just doing the sort of the test case, the in vitro version of the experiment, wasn't producing anything realistic. All right, well, we should wrap up here. So thanks for joining us, and Merry Christmas, or whatever else you do at this time of year, and look forward to seeing you again in the future, probably in the new year. So thanks, and bye for now.